Ever since I first came across one of Steve Shives' anti-YouTube atheist videos, I thought to myself, I gotta do a response video to this guy. That day has come, and I'm really looking forward to doing my best to show just how awful this guy can be. Let's get into it.
Yes, I'm a YouTube atheist, but try not to hold that against me, okay? Here are 5 toxic things about YouTube atheism. Number 1, it has a sexism problem. Many of the most popular atheists on YouTube are brazen anti-feminists who insult and belittle women and men, but mostly women, who speak out against gender inequality.
So we start off with Steve complaining that many YouTube atheists belittle women. Okay, how many? Well, in Steve's mind, that would be about n minus 5, 5 being the number of internet atheists he approves of. PZ Meyer, Aaron Ra, I'm looking at you. So, how does Steve get across this particularly important concept? By flashing a graphic showing a scruffy man with his fist raised against a teary-eyed woman who obviously does not have the agency to defend herself. Not only is this man physically threatening, he's also verbally abusing this woman by saying in bold letters, feminism, your, and rational debate, all of which we know are incredibly triggering words.
They also proudly deny the existences of things like the wage gap, rape culture, gender imbalances in political and cultural representation, and other problems that are widely accepted and seriously discussed outside of the misogynist circle jerk that is the atheist community on YouTube.
Existences? I'll give you that one, Steve. But seriously, how can anyone discuss, openly and rationally, these tired old feminist tropes? Unless you're Atheism Plus, of course, in which case it's easy as hell. It's mind-boggling that anyone could trot these things out and expect anyone with half a brain to believe them nowadays. Every one of the ones that Steve mentions is completely falsifiable or explained away with simple statistics.
But lest you think that sexism is the only form of bigotry running rampant in atheist spaces on YouTube, let me assure you, number 2, it also has a racism problem. And it's the best kind of racism too, the willfully oblivious kind. One of the most subscribed to atheists on YouTube recently made videos espousing his views that, for example, black Americans who speak out against racial injustice are part of a victim cult, or the displacement of black folks by gentrification isn't a problem because it results in nicer neighborhoods with fewer thugs hanging around, or, my personal favorite, the true outrage isn't racism, but people calling people like him racists. Because why would anyone think that the white guy who makes a virtue out of publicly not giving a shit about black people was a racist? It's ridiculous.
I'm starting to think Steve Shives has a fetish for guys in scruffy beards. I'm starting to think Steve Shives has a fetish for himself. Anyway, Steve is in his little cage, flinging poo all around the place, trying to see if it sticks to anything. And the person he's flinging it at this time is the Amazing Atheist, otherwise known as TJ to his nearly 1 million fans. I don't know why Steve is such a bitch about calling TJ out, but it's up to Steve to do so, so I'll let him have it. TJ has made a video delineating how his views are being misrepresented by people like Steve Shives. And his video does a very good job of explaining why these things are not the way Shives and others would like you to think they are. I suggest you all watch it if you haven't already, and I certainly suggest Steve watches it, although I doubt he'll get anything out of it.
Hang on, I'm not done. Number 3, it has a religious bigotry problem too. The ugliest religious bigotry in the YouTube atheist community is, of course, directed at Muslims, who are commonly stereotyped as potential terrorists and whose religion is viewed as inherently worse and more dangerous than any other.
This is where it gets really weird. Steve is complaining that YouTube atheists are calling Muslims dangerous. YouTube atheists are not calling Muslims dangerous. They're calling Islam dangerous. Muslims are not all dangerous. Again, Steve, not all. So why in God's green earth is Steve defending a religion? He's supposed to be an atheist, for crying out loud. Well, it goes to show that Steve's more concerned with victim culture than he is about his own principles. If it were Christianity or creationists, Steve would be all over it. But since it's Muslims, and he sees them as being oppressed, he runs to their rescue. Thank God for Steve, say the Muslims.
But there's still plenty of judgmental condescension left over for Christians and religious folks in general. Many YouTube atheists will still cite belief in God as evidence of mental illness, thus denigrating religious folks and the mentally ill at the same time.
Now Steve talks about how mean YouTube atheists are to Christians and other religious groups. I'm sorry, Steve, I didn't know there was a threshold that an atheist had to follow when denigrating a religion. It makes no sense to me how you could even say this and call yourself an atheist. Oh, wait a minute. You're not an atheist. You're an atheist plus, which means that social issues override your atheism. I understand now. So, Steve, YouTube atheists call the religious mentally ill? Really? Oh, wait. That's just another straw man you've built. Let's see how long it lasts. Oh, it's gone. Geez, that took less than half a second, didn't it? I didn't even have to pull out my torch.
Number 4, it's addicted to drama and conflict. Some of the most watched atheists on YouTube today began making videos in response to creationists. Some of them conducted themselves with class, dignity, and intellectual honesty, striving to have civil conversations with often exasperating adversaries. But even back in those less fractious early years, before the community's pervasive racism and sexism surfaced, the most popular personalities were those who gleefully bullied their targets.
Once again, another over-the-top graphic that builds a straw man, Steve. What are you now, 3 for 3, something like that? At least he doesn't have a beard this time. Let's hear it for the clean-shaven minority. So the good old days were less fractious. Who divided the YouTube community, Steve? When did racism and sexism become pervasive? When Atheism Plus came to town. You people made anti-Islam equal anti-Muslim, and you also made a disagreement with the feminist equal sexism. You're the fucking problem, Shives. You're the one whose sole purpose in life is to drive a wedge into the YouTube atheism community. Are you proud of yourself?
Small wonder then that once the creationist opponents had been exhausted, the bullies turned and found new enemies within atheist circles. And it turns out that most people who enjoyed watching obnoxious white dudes attack Christians were just as entertained by watching those same obnoxious white dudes attack women, Muslims, and racial justice activists.
There goes Steve again, pining for the fjords. The good old days, when men were men, atheists were kind, and women were feminists. They've always been feminists. What am I thinking? And what's this about obnoxious white guys? Why white guys, Steve? Couldn't it have been Tyler Preston or that guy T? Nah, they don't count. They're black. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Should I, Steve? And what's wrong with going after new people to debate? Or even to debunk? So what if the creationist and Christian avenues dried up? Why can't you move on to other things? And what's the big deal that we went after your lovely protected groups? Women, Muslims, social justice activists. You know, 2 of those are yourself, Steve. But I'm not saying which 2.
That the YouTube atheist community is now dominated by professional trolls who manufacture conflict in order to generate content and views would be bad enough if the damage they caused was confined to YouTube. But it's not.
And Steve is right. This damage is not confined to YouTube. It's spread all over the internet. And it's spread in places like Free Thought blogs, where P.Z. Meyer reigns supreme, raining down disdain on those little peons he determines are well below his intellectual reach. And again, no sense of irony in these declarations whatsoever.
Number 5, it reflects poorly on the rest of the atheist movement. Ever wonder why, with a few notable exceptions, YouTube atheists are not invited to address secular conferences or represent atheist organizations to the public?
Once again a straw man graphic, this time a young child, who can't grow a scruffy beard, so we'll give Steve a pass on this one. Now, let's talk about who you think is good enough to represent atheism at conferences and public gatherings. How about Richard Dawkins? Would Professor Dawkins be good enough, Steve? Well, apparently not good enough for the Northeast Conference on Science and Skepticism, otherwise known as Nexus. You see, Nexus had invited Richard Dawkins to be their keynote speaker at their event earlier this year. Dawkins accepted, and all seemed well. Then Dawkins did something really, really bad. He found a cartoon on Sargon of Akkad's YouTube site satirizing Islamism and feminism. So Dawkins tweeted this cartoon, and the Atheism Plus community lost their shit. They couldn't believe anyone of Richard's stature could do such a terrible thing. So how did they handle it? They told him he was no longer going to be speaking at the conference. But it seemed to have caused him some grief. More on that in a moment. The true atheist community, upon hearing about Dawkins' no platforming, were immediately up in arms, and rightfully so. They demanded that Nexus bring Dawkins back to the conference. And after much soul-searching and navel-gazing, Nexus agreed. They wrote a nice letter to Dawkins, explaining that they were wrong, and that they would like him to come back. Yes, folks, you heard me right. Atheism Plus social justice warriors actually admitting that they had done something wrong. Only Richard Dawkins could have achieved such a result. Tragically, Dawkins had suffered a small stroke, which his doctors felt was brought on by the tension caused by Nexus's actions. Because of this, Professor Dawkins was unable to travel, and Nexus had to deal with the cancellations and demands for refunds brought on by their idiocy. Even though Dawkins is known to be prickly in the presence of stupidity, he remained a class act throughout this entire ordeal. So, Steve, tell us again about people who are good enough to represent the atheist community at public events and those who aren't. Please, illuminate us.
If you're lucky, your first contact with atheism on YouTube came in the form of one of the more responsible voices, like Aaron Ra, Seth Andrews, or Matt Dillahunty. But unfortunately, it's much more likely that before you got to them, you discovered one of the people I'm talking about in this video, one of the proudly offensive, cluelessly bigoted assholes who might as well be caricatures of atheists drawn by alarmist evangelists.
Steve could include himself on this list as one of the really, really good atheists on YouTube. It seems that he has become the final arbiter as to who is pure and who is scum. Once again, he can't name any names, which is good because he has no proof for what he's saying.
We atheists like to pat ourselves on the back for being more reasonable than the religious folks, but I don't think that's true. And judging by the most visible representatives of our movement on YouTube, the most unreasonable belief shared by many of us might be the belief that we're the reasonable ones.
I'm not really one to pat myself on the back, nor have I noticed this trend in any other of the YouTube atheists. So I really don't know where Steve's coming from with this, unless it's just personal experience, which I don't doubt at all. He also talks about being reasonable, and how he considers the current crop of YouTube atheists to not be that way, while he, of course, is the height of reasonableness. The problem there, of course, is Steve has no reason whatsoever. He has no logic. He only has faith. And with faith comes hubris, and with hubris comes the fall. And if Steve's paying attention to his metrics at all, he knows that's where his channel's headed. And I'm happy to help. I promised you something special at the end of the video, and here we are. This is Steve Shives' list of references for his video. Links to articles discussing the various problems with atheism, he says. Articles. Right. First up we have 5 ways atheists argue their cause that aren't helping. It's on crack.com, which, as we know, is a humor source. Not exactly hard news. It gets better. The Amazing Atheist Racism is on Patheos, another blog. But that's not the only time Patheos shows up. The Amazing Atheist unites he's a racist by being racist. Patheos once again. The atheist community needs to do a better job of welcoming people of color. Patheos once again. Battle Journal. The great shushing of atheist feminists on YouTube continues. Patheos. Do you see a trend here? Next up is Stalebread Atheism on theorbit.net. Not much by the way of a news source, now is it? Preaching to the Choir, the Cult of Online Atheism, on MirrorChart WordPress. In other words, a blog. Nice job, Steve. Another one by Orbit.net, Something is Rotten in Atheism, The Amazing Atheist and Secular Racism. Then YouTube Atheists and Battling Online SJW Haters, an interview with Aaron Ra. This is the closest anything comes to being a news source, but it's on The Humanist. And we all know that The Humanist is nothing more than an SJW rag now, so we can discount that quite readily. And last but not least, oh crap, another YouTube misogynist by Free Thought Blogs, and none other than our old tiny tyrant, P.Z. Myers. Go figure. Steve saved the best for last. So there you have it. That's what's left of Steve Shives' attempt to sully the reputation of all YouTube atheists who do not toe his party line, and especially the Amazing Atheist for not putting up with Steve's shit. Silly, petty, and all Shives. And now, an anecdote. I met a very nice lady the other day, and we talked for quite a while. At the end of the evening, she said, "I very much enjoyed meeting you." And I replied, "You'll get over it. Everyone does." Thank you for your attention.